All right, let's get started since we have a lot to discuss. I wanted to, first of all, just recall something from the birth of tragedy from last week. And then we will transition into the discussion on the genealogy of morals that we had for this week. We also had in our reading for this week another early Nietzsche work, which is on truth and lie in an extramoral sense. So I think I mentioned the early Nietzsche and the late Nietzsche. That's already been thematized to a certain degree by Nietzsche's attempt at self-criticism, his preface for the republication of the birth of tragedy. But we're going to be paying attention to some continuities between the early and the late Nietzsche. Especially when it comes to the question of truth. So last week we talked about subjective versus objective truth and the three different disciplines of art, philosophy, and science. So we're going to return to that theme tonight very strongly. I'm going to download our Nietzsche reading again. Did I have a volunteer for this week to post notes? I did?
They're getting posted right now.
Oh, okay, you're getting ready to post it. All right, good, thank you. Oh, I see one.
I just put that up there.
Okay, very good. Cool, thank you. All right, so let's look at, to download our Nietzsche, but also bring up our truth and lie in an extramoral sense. All right, so in terms of, let's look up the birth of tragedy first of all. What I wanted to do is just recall something from the preface. The attempt at self-criticism. Let me get to where he, oops. Hold on a second. We looked at where he said, you know, what must have been driving this early work, the questions, but what we didn't look at, hold on. Oops. All right. This file's defeating me. Give me a second here. I'm going to call it up very easily. I think that we talked about the pessimism of strength. That's going to be something that we return to a little bit. All right, so the problem of science itself and the contrast between art and science, that's what we were dealing with last time. And I mentioned that this time we're going to be further differentiating art, philosophy, and science. So with theoretical man, with Socrates, the birth of theoretical man is a distinction between art on the one hand and philosophy and science on the other hand. Now he's going to really separate philosophy from science. And he's going to problematize less theoretical man, philosophy and science, and more philosophy. So he's not going to problematize science in the same way that he did in the early work. It's important to bear in mind. But what he asked, especially regarding the Greeks, but also for his own time in terms of a potential rebirth of tragedy, is what would it mean to justify life with art? So that will again recall for us Schiller. So the play drive, right? So we are, play is the most human of faculties, and we are most human when we are at play. That's Schiller. So similarly for Nietzsche, art would appear to be a better justification for life than truth in the sense of theoretical man. Scientific truth, but also philosophical truth understood in the Western tradition coming down from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So if you recall last time, when Aristotle philosophizes about art in the Poetics, that already marks the death of art, the death of tragedy, but the death of art. Once you're philosophizing about it, then its truth is no longer self-evident. You're explaining it to yourself in a way that shows that the art is no longer doing what it's supposed to do. And again, the question of how and why that might have happened, where the birth of theoretical man comes from, it's going to return on the genealogy of morals. But art is a justification of life. What we will see is that he's no longer working with that paradigm on the genealogy of morals, but rather, and we'll see on truth and lie in an extra moral sense, truth, the pursuit of truth, might be the justification for life, at least one aspect of the justification for life, for human life. And he's going to situate that within a broader category that he had not yet introduced in The Birth of Tragedy, and that's the will to power. So the will to power is a concept that he was meant to elaborate in a book that he never finished. And that was edited by his sister and published under dubious provenance in terms of how accurate it is. We also have the original notes, and so scholars have been able to pore over the distinctions between his sister's version and his own version of this will to power. But we'll talk about that when we get to On the Genealogy of Morals. So truth as a human form of the will to power. If will to power characterizes all life has the character of a will to power, then truth is a peculiar manifestation, or one of the peculiar manifestations of the human will to power. I'll also say that Schiller, and thinking about the will to power and justification of life, Schiller also said that the animals play as well, right? So humans are most human when they're at play. The most human faculty is the play drive, but it distinguishes us from the animals only in degree rather than in kind. Because all life, Schiller thought, manifested the play drive. So life for its own sake. This is something that we were talking about with respect to Kant. So teleological beings that exist for their own sake, life for its own sake. We talked about art, philosophy, and science descending from religion. So in a religious cosmology, we can stick to the example of the Western cultural and civilizational tradition, so the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. But it would apply to really any religious cosmology, any religious community, that human life doesn't exist for its own sake, but exists under some kind of divine task or mandate. Meaning, human life is not a value in and of itself, it's only a value insofar as it serves God's purposes. The modern world, by contrast, raises the question of human life as a value in itself. Also recalling Kant and Schiller, life as a value in and of itself and human life as a value in itself is freedom. Right, so existing for one's own sake in a self-determining way, humanity, not just the individual human being, but humanity more generally existing for its own sake. That is freedom. So it's autonomy, self-determination, sovereignty, self-legislation, giving ourselves our own laws to follow. Now, Hegel, to sort of keep all of the things we've been reading in play, Hegel, his way of thinking about the appearance of Geist, the manifest phenomenon of Geist, of spirit, and the movement of spirit, goes through these phases of religion, art, and philosophy. Also looked at another way, art, religion, philosophy, but religion means two different things in those contexts. So when it's art, religion, philosophy, religion there is really more theology. Whereas when it's religion, art, philosophy, then religion is more a question of morality. Right, so morality would be the more practical aspect, and theology would be the more theoretical aspect. Okay, so this is the phases of appearance of Geist, or spirit, or really freedom. Again, freedom is understood as self-determination, using Kant's language, self-legislation, choosing our own purpose, having ourselves as our own purpose, but also choosing the form in which that purpose manifests, and maybe even the purpose itself, not just the form in which it appears. So, life for its own sake. This is what Nietzsche is agonizing about. And he's revisiting in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, the death of God, right? The death of God. So a very famous, infamous statement of Nietzsche's. Actually, it's not simply a statement of Nietzsche's. It's voiced through a character in an aphorism in the gay science, or the happy science, as opposed to the morbid science, or the dismal science. God is dead, and we have killed him. God is dead and we have killed him, which means that we probably had something to do with God being alive. Right? God is dead and we have killed him, meaning the life and death of God has to do with us. Right? We can bring God to life, we can kill God. Right? Which is an interesting kind of way of thinking about it, because of course usually we think of it the other way, which is that it's God that gives us life. It's God that creates us. No, this is a reversal of that idea. Okay. Not sure if I provided this on the, let's see if I did provide that. Sometimes I do, but maybe we did not. Oh, BBC documentary. This is, I'm sure, the wrong. Oh, it's there. You want to watch a little clip? This will be appropriate to the truth in line and extra moral sense. So this is the BBC documentary. Okay, we don't need the copyright warning. Do we need the little, we might need. Oh my God. What a nightmare. They did 3, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Heidegger.
I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous. A crisis without equal on Earth. The most profound collision of conscience, conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. Where you see ideals, I see what is human. Alas, all too human.
These are the words of the visionary German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The crisis he is predicting was the crisis of religious faith that would sweep through Europe in the late 19th century. Nietzsche was the first thinker to realize that the death of God would give birth to something entirely new in human history. The idea of absolute freedom, of man as the sole measure of the universe. What he was describing was nothing less than the birth pangs of the modern world.
All right, that's my clip. All right, so now there are some things that are truncated historically, or telescoped, we might say. Namely, the crisis of religious faith is a lot older than the late 1800s. Actually goes back to the crisis of Christianity in the Protestant Reformation in the bourgeois era. So the humanism emerging with the Renaissance, and a kind of humanized and secularized Christianity in the Protestant Reformation. And it's really that Protestantized, the Protestant form of Christianity, the bourgeoisified, the transformed Christianity that Nietzsche is concerned. The Enlightenment had already taken aim at religious authority. So in the 1600s and 1700s, there was already a hostility on the part of philosophers to theology and to traditional metaphysics related to theology. So even where Enlightenment philosophers, all the way up to and including Kant and Hegel, when they talked about God, they still separated that question of religious faith from reason in a way that theology always kept them connected. So Kant has a famous piece called The Idea of God from the Standpoint of Reason, and he says, we can't prove the existence of God by reason, but only take it on faith, which at the time people saw as a radically atheistic philosophy, as a rejection of theology, but thereby a rejection of the earlier basis of faith. Okay, so the modern world, the birth pangs of the modern world, Of course, by locating that in the late 1800s, as the BBC documentary does, really what's being addressed, and we're going to get into it today, capitalism. It's really the capitalist world that is being articulated. So the birth pangs of the modern world, meaning the capitalist world, rather than the modern world in terms of early modernity, the Renaissance, or the bourgeois era and the Enlightenment, right? Again, the sort of Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, as well as the social and political and economic changes to traditional civilization. Okay. So let's look at just a couple of things from On Truth and Lie in an Extra Moral Sense. Again, this is an early Nietzsche piece, so roughly contemporaneous with the thinking we encountered in The Birth of Tragedy. So first of all, on truth and lie in an extra moral sense. So truth, okay, lie. Lying. Suggests morality, suggests a immoral act to lie, but in an extra moral sense. So separating truth from the morally good. Right. So truth and lie in an extra moral sense. Not truth and falsehood, but lying. Right. So a little bit different. Not in terms of kind of epistemological truth, or what Kant described through the understanding, through theory, through concepts, like true concepts, true theories, true understandings, as opposed to false ones. No, it's lying. So he does this funny thing just in the title of both taking it outside the realm of morality, but also keeping the realm of morality in play. All right, so here's Nietzsche. In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. That was the haughtiest and most mendacious minute of world history. Yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold and the clever animals had to die. One might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated how sufficiently wretched, how shadowy, and how flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done for again, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer gives it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that it floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. There is nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as every porter wants to be once an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his action and his thought. Okay, so first of all, let's think about what perspective that is taken from. All right, so what's this perspective on human life on Earth that he's describing with his opening fable?
It's touring from that humanistic perspective. It's claiming that, yes, we would think that we're a committed creature. Humanity is all encompassing and powerful, but if we look through another perspective, we all ought to live and exist, as in all the creatures.
Maybe. Yeah, the mosquito has just as right as we do.
It will think
It might,
Yeah.
but it will never ask itself that question. That's the difference, right? So, but the perspective from which he's seeing the clever animals on the insignificant planet, what does he say? Oh, no, he doesn't say insignificant planet. That's me.
There's the word insignificant.
It is, but where is it? Yeah, it's later on. Okay, so remote corner of the universe, not the center of the universe, remote corner of the universe. So this is a God-like perspective on humanity. It's a perspective on humanity from before humans existed and after humans ceased to exist. Right? So it's a perspective on humanity that humanity cannot have of itself, and yet, of course, humanity can have this perspective on itself. Meaning humans can think about the universe before there were humans, and can imagine a universe without humans. Right? So it's a godlike perspective that is actually our perspective on ourselves.
Also,
We invented it, right? So, I mean, right? So I'll just say also that even if God were to exist, Nietzsche is assuming not. There's no particular reason why humans would be the center of God's creation, except for the fact religion tells us so, right? So religion tells us that out of all of God's creation, humans are the special creation at the center of God's creation, right? So we have a privileged relationship to God that the other animals don't have, according to religion. But again, from Nietzsche's perspective, this would be a fable that we tell ourselves. Okay, so knowledge. So I mentioned epistemology. So looked at epistemologically, again from Kant's tripartite division of philosophy. So the understanding, the faculty of understanding, the true use of concepts and theories, a true understanding, knowledge, knowing. All right, so what is knowledge? And what's the truth of our knowledge? So he sort of sets up immediately the truth of our knowledge is subjective, it's particular, it's self-centered. Then he also distinguishes, so he's not just talking about the clever animals, he's talking about the philosopher, which isn't necessarily the cleverest animal, but has a certain conception of knowledge and of the truth of that knowledge. So he says, the haughtiness which goes with knowledge and feeling, which shrouds the eyes and senses of man in a blinding fog, therefore deceives him about the value of existence, by carrying in itself the most flattering evaluation of knowledge itself. Its most universal effect is deception, but even its most particular effects have something of the same character. Right, so, and then he gets into it, we have intelligence the way other animals have fangs and claws. Okay. I'm going to skip to the end of this selection from On Truth and Lie. And okay. So he says, only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth in the sense just designated. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of a tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he will forever buy illusions for truths. What is a word? The image of a nerve stimulus in sounds. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. Now recall from The Birth of Tragedy that theoretical man is characterized by an external notion of truth. So it's objective truth, it's truth outside of us. And what he says there is that the pursuit of truth becomes an unplumbable depth. Right, so it's a kind of an infinite task. We can never get to the bottom of things. We can never get to the entirety of truth. So the birth of theoretical man is to give us this kind of limitless, and ultimately unsatisfiable urge. So, which he here says is false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. That's a cause outside of us. The different languages set side by side show that what matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression, else there would be not so many languages. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to man, and to express them, one calls on the boldest metaphors. A nerve stimulus first transposed into an image, that's the first metaphor. The image in turn imitated by a sound, which is a second metaphor. And I think that I've mentioned to you guys the social relations. Did we talk about that? So the cosmology. Or the universe. Of our social relations, which are not just relations between people, so they are that, but also relations to and with nature, and nature, capital N nature, everything that exists. And a relation to ourselves. It's a self-relation. So relation between people, relation to nature, everything that exists. It's a relation to things, and relation to oneself. So that would be our social relations, our universe, our cosmology. This is a Marxian term, but it's also a term from sociology. Predates Marx, it's not original to Marx, and I said Marx is this kind of figure at the center in some ways, but missing in our course, but that's okay. We'll come at Marx indirectly. So what is designated by language, what is signified, to use a postmodernist or a linguistical term, I think that I mentioned already that we're not dealing with philosophies or theories of representation, but rather of expression, right? But okay, designate. Designates not the thing in itself, but the relation to things, right? So what the word designates is not the thing in itself, but our relation to it. Okay.
That's why it's called metaphor.
That's why it's a metaphor. That's right, yeah. Because, right, we're talking about the thing, but we're really talking about our relation to the thing. And so what the sort of significance of the thing, the image of the thing, tells us something about how we relate to it. And he says, let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts. Okay, so he's got words, he's got concepts. So they're different. So this course is also quite contrary not only to theories of representation, but also to semiotics. Semiotics is crap. So it's not just a signified signifier business. No, meaning is more than that. Concepts, right? So concepts, the begriff, that with which we grasp things, how we apprehend things with our minds. That's not just a label that you slap onto something, which is what the signified signifier reduces it to, right? Words are not merely labels. No, they're images, they're relations. Still less are concepts simply labels that we slap on things. No, they're that with which we grasp things in our mind. So the formation of concepts. What Nietzsche has to say about that. Every word immediately becomes a concept. Again, words and concepts are not the same thing. Becomes a concept in so much, or in as much, as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal. In other words, a lot of unequal cases. Okay, so notice it's not unequal things, it's unequal cases. Cases of what? Of our experience of the things. It's a reminder of an individual experience. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. No leaf ever wholly equals another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions. And now it gives rise to the idea that in nature there might be something besides the leaves, which would be leaf, some kind of original form after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be a correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. So again, not things, but our image and the form of the image of things, our relation to things, our experience of them. Now I just want to point something out in a little postmodernism. So we're in our postmodernist moment, which is where I take my license to pedagogy from living in a postmodernist moment. When I was here as an MFA student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, we were deep in postmodernism and nobody could teach the stuff like this the way I do now. I get my revenge on academia by teaching. There's no feminism. There are only feminisms. There's no leaf. There are only leaves. The pluralization of things. No, that's a dodge. And it's taken from Nietzsche, but it's a bastardization of Nietzsche. It's not really Nietzsche. It's a pseudo-Nietzscheanism. A lot of postmodernism is pseudo-Nietzscheanism. Oh, there's no leaf. There are only leaves. No, there's a leaf. There's a concept. Nietzsche's concerned. Where do we get that concept from? He's not just saying there are no meaning or significance to the concept. No. We call a person honest. Why did he act so honestly today? So again, morality is suggested by a virtue, like honesty. It's practical, it's an act. But he acts so honestly today. And we ask. Our answer usually sounds like this, because of his honesty. Honesty. That is to say, again, the leaf is the cause of the leaves. So an honest act, honesty. Honesty is a metaphysical object. An honest act is not a metaphysical object, but honesty as a virtue is a metaphysical object. Right, so again, Nietzsche's usually, in a bowdlerized way, enlisted into a kind of cheap anti-metaphysics. Right? No, honesty. He wants to know, where does this come from? Not that it doesn't exist. The leaf is the cause of the leaves. Honesty is the cause of an honest act. After all, we know nothing of an essence-like quality named honesty. We know only numerous individualized and thus unequal actions, which we equate by omitting the unequal and by then calling them honest actions. In the end, we distill from them a occult quality with the name of honesty. What then is truth? Another metaphysics. A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where this urge for truth comes from, for as yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie heard like in a style obligatory for all. All right, so again, reading this against the usual grain of how Nietzsche is enlisted, especially for postmodernism, it's important to know that even if it's a lie, it's an obligatory lie. Right? And if it's an illusion, it's a necessary illusion. So thinking back to The Birth of Tragedy, the appearance of appearance. What's the necessity of art? To consider the appearance of appearance. Meaning to consider appearance as such. And to consider what the appearance of the world means. Meaning what's motivating it. Why do we experience the world the way that we do? Why does it appear to us as it does? Right? Again, subjective truth. But what kind of subject? Why do we have the subjectivity that we have? Especially because, as we're going to see, that subjectivity can change. It can change very radically. It has changed radically. So I mentioned when we did Kant, the true, the good, and the beautiful, the ancient virtues, which the ancients took because they lived in traditional cultures that sought to maintain themselves, to preserve themselves, as eternal values, but which modern people, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, must recognize as changeable. Meaning, if all cultures, if all societies have had these values, the true, the good, and the beautiful, nonetheless, across history and across different cultures, there are different truths, there are different moralities, there are different conceptions of the good, and there are different experiences of the beautiful. And that's the essence of these values, is that they are attributes of our freedom, meaning they're not given from a divine source outside of us, but they are our values. So they're subjective values of our freedom. So again, the BBC little clip, the little intro, why do I play that? Because freedom. Even if the BBC motherfuckers can understand that Nietzsche is about freedom, we should. Sorry, there's a certain animus because out in the world, where I'm a public intellectual of sorts, I'm in dialogue and debate with people who are very anti-Nietzsche and who see Nietzsche as a right-wing thinker. He's a philosopher of freedom. He was not a Nazi, absolutely not. He was assimilated to Nazism later, but so were a lot of other people. So, okay, so let's talk about this history. Shall we talk about this history? Thanks for that, because I need this. I need the typical reception, right? So last time we talked about how Nietzsche is a figure of this period between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. I think he dies in 1900. Yeah, he dies in 1900. But then that's preceded by maybe 10 years of him being basically catatonic. Right, so he has a mental breakdown, he's catatonic. His sister takes care of him. His sister enlists Nietzsche's work into her and her husband's crazy German nationalism and anti-Semitism, but we'll see that that's a total, right? And then she also used to like have guests over and show them her brother, right, who's in bed, catatonic, the tragic genius. Oh yeah, creepy. Total creepy as fuck. Yeah, total. So she's a problem, to say the least. And then World War One. So World War One. So I bring this up only because the Germans are on one side of World War One, and the German world, we could say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are the allies of Germany, of the Prussian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So those are the central powers who are opposed by the Entente, which is the British, the French, and the Russians. And then the Americans come in at the end and take over the world. So out of the ruins of Europe, out of World War I. Although then they disclaim responsibility for it, and then they're forced to take responsibility for it after World War II. Okay, so at the time, the Anglophone world, the French a little bit too, but less so. But the British and the Americans are like, what the hell is wrong with these Germans? Oh, they have these crazy philosophers, Hegel and Nietzsche. It seems to be these elaborate philosophical justifications for German nationalism. So that must be why the Germans are so fucked up, because they have this fucked up philosophy. Right? And it's a kind of irrationalist philosophy, right? It's unscientific, it's illogical, the Hegelian dialectic, the Nietzschean will to power, what the fuck? Right? So they blame, before the Nazis, they blame Nietzsche already for World War I. It's not helped by the fact that the German government also put little copies of Das Volk Zarathustra into the pockets of the soldiers that they sent to the front, so that you knew what you were fighting for. You were fighting for the country that gave us Nietzsche. And so that's fucked up. Very, very contrary to Nietzsche's own intentions. Because as we talked about last time, Nietzsche had a very traumatic experience of the Franco-Prussian War and was very disgusted by the German triumphalism of their victory over the French in the Franco-Prussian War. Very bitter about it. We'll see what he says in the reading that we did before tonight about German nationalism. So he's very opposed to German nationalism, and he's also not an anti-Semite, but we'll get there. All right, so the Nazis come out of the German defeat of World War I, so they're bitter about that. Then Hitler, to a certain extent, but generally the fascist movement sort of takes up Nietzsche in this nationalistic way. And then the Nazis, the rise of Nazis, and the World War II are again blamed in the Anglophone world on not only Nietzsche, but also Hegel. Because by that time, of course, we have the Russian Revolution, we have communism, and so the idea is that the Germans gave us these totalitarian philosophers, Hegel and Nietzsche and Marx. These totalitarian philosophers, and that's what's wrong with the Germans, and we, good, sensible, commonsensical, empiricists, rational, English and Anglophone people, we resist this German insanity. That gives you totalitarianism, gives you fascism, gives you communism, Marxism, the whole gamut. Okay. That's just there, that's there. So just so you know. Since we are reading all Krauts all the time in this course, just understand that there is a philosophical and also political tradition that regards it as the source of the evils of the 20th century. So when Nietzsche, they quoted Nietzsche saying, I know I am going to be associated with something tremendous. Now you know that the BBC documentary is thinking, the Holocaust, Nazis, blah. And that's not what Nietzsche was thinking. It's actually not what Nietzsche was thinking. But we'll get there. Okay. What's what I want to say about this? All right, we'll come back to it. Okay, so first of all, I want to say something about the title. It's always good to pay attention to the title. On the genealogy of morals, did we already get past the title page? Let's see. I know, we'll get there. On the genealogy of morals. So it's not the genealogy of morals. It's important to keep in mind. It's not the genealogy of morals, it's on the genealogy of morals. Meaning he's problematizing the idea of a genealogy of morals. Why would he do that? Well, a historical tradition, a lineage of modern morality. Right? The idea that the 19th century had in Nietzsche's own time. All right, hold on. He has, here we go, a polemic. A polemic. So in the 19th century, there was a notion of moral progress. The idea is that with regard to the past, the modern world is more moral than the world was previously. So there's been moral progress. It's kind of a quantitative relation between the past and the present. We become more moral across history, and we strive to be more moral. So a quantitative increase in morality. So Nietzsche's attacking that idea. Attacking the idea of moral progress. Instead, and again this is near and dear to the postmodernist heart, it's not a matter of a universal history of moral progress at which the West stands in the forefront. No, rather there is qualitative change, different moralities across history and across cultures. So not increased morality in a quantitative sense, but a qualitative change in morality. Different moralities across history. And if there is a history to this, it's not one of linear progress, of quantitative increase in morality, but rather of revolutions, revolts in morality. So what he calls the transvaluation of values. Transvaluation of values, a qualitative transformation, a different morality emerging out of an old morality. The slave revolt in morality. That is a reversal of the preceding morality. Right, so it's not just a matter of gradual evolutionary progress, quantitative increase in morality, but rather reversals in morality, for which the slave revolt in morality is the paradigmatic example, in which he thinks European civilization, at least in his time, is still struggling with that originary slave revolt of morality that distinguishes the West from the rest. So I mentioned with Hegel the three ancient cities, the cities of the ancient Mediterranean world that give rise to the West: Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. This is a kind of a German idea for sure, but also more broadly, this is a understanding of so-called Western history, Western civilization. So of course the slave revolt in morality would characterize the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, would characterize, first of all, the history of religion. So keeping that in mind, so I mentioned how he was enlisted to anti-Semitism. In some ways, he's rather the opposite. He's a kind of philo-Semite, but we'll see. The example of this would be the Exodus. Right. The Jews revolting against their enslavement in Egypt, and the Exodus from Egypt, and the going to the Promised Land. Which involved the destruction of Egyptian civilization in their view. Right, so it's not merely their escape, but also it's God's punishment of the Egyptians. Also, Pharaoh can't help himself. He leads an army in pursuit. God parts the waters of the Red Sea. The Jews go through it, and then God wipes out the Egyptian army, including the Pharaoh. Okay, so in Nietzsche's view, the Egyptians are the the warrior caste. They're the sort of kick-ass, beautiful people. The Jews are the wretched, conquered people, the slaves. Right, so that's, if we just keep that in mind, sort of scriptural history or biblical history as his main example of this. Now he leaves aside some other things in that characterization, meaning he leaves aside the priestly caste of the Egyptians. Instead, the priestly caste are those who are in league with the slave revolt and morality. So I bring that up, a polemic against the genealogy of morality, revolutions, reversals in morality, qualitative difference and transformation of morality. He thinks that the modern world is on the brink of another one, of another such revolution. So if you've heard of the Nietzschean Superman, it's not the Superman, it's the Overman. So what is the Overman? It doesn't mean some men over other men. It means the self-overcoming of man, of das Man. It's the humanity that has overcome itself in its form. So there's the Overman, and there's the last man. So he thinks that this is where Europe is at this kind of crisis point, this brink. It's come to a certain end in terms of this tradition, the tradition of the slave revolt and morality, the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition. That modernity is a kind of a terminus, but also a crisis point in which the choices are presented: Overman or last man. Meaning, do we stay stuck at this terminal point, or do we overcome it? And of course he thinks we're going to overcome it. Right, so when we looked at the dialectic of being and becoming, we talked about the Nietzschean phrase, self-overcoming. So not merely becoming, but self-overcoming. Self-overcoming not just as an individual characteristic, but the characteristic of, we'll see, all forms of life. The will to power is an expression, or we should say, the will to power is expressed in a self-overcoming. Not just at the individual level, although it can also manifest there, but at a cultural level, at the level of a people, as he put it in On Truth and Lie in an extra moral sense, or a culture or civilization. So what would the self-overcoming of the West be? What would be the self-overcoming of European civilization? Right, that's what he's posing. What would be the self-overcoming of Christianity? Now, in some ways, he's projecting that into the future. In other ways, he thinks that we're in it. So in the end of the 19th century, we're already in the midst of that process. And perhaps we've been in the midst of that process ever since the Renaissance, ever since the Enlightenment, certainly by the time that he's writing. So did I mention that Nietzsche has another one of his quips? He's famous for these quips about the Germans. Again, his anti-Germanism or his rancor with respect to Germany and its role in history. That the Germans have brought about an end. We're going to read this in next week's reading, in the case of Wagner, so wait for it, in terms of actually reading it on the page. The Germans have brought an end to all the great flowerings of European civilization. The Germans brought an end to the classical ancient Mediterranean world, right? The Germans sacked Rome. The Germans, with their crazy Luther maniac at the head through the Protestant Reformation, brought an end to the Renaissance, to the rebirth. And the Germans, in the form of Kant and Schiller and Hegel, brought an end to the Enlightenment. All right, so classical antiquity, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment, he considers to be authentic flowerings of European civilization, but then the Germans come in and mess it up, ruin it. And he thinks that the 19th century, his time, is the consequence of that. And yet, the tasks from the past that have been sort of botched by the Germans remain. So the task of the Renaissance, the task of the Enlightenment remains. The task of the modern remains. So I mentioned that Nietzsche was influenced by Baudelaire, who's the other figure besides Marx, who's sort of at the center of our timeline, but not on our syllabus. And we talked about the modernity and modernism. Nietzsche is very much influenced by Baudelaire's perspective on that. So his polemic on the genealogy rules. So I would also say, when you hear there's another postmodernism about genealogies of this and that, or lineages of this and that, this is a kind of a pseudo-Nietzscheanism. So Foucault is known for this, for his genealogies. No. And if you read his essay on Nietzsche, Foucault, Nietzsche, Genealogy and Truth, he says, we need to take from Nietzsche this attention to history and its peregrinations, its sort of non-linear path. But he says, but we need to abandon from Nietzsche, he still believes in freedom. We need to abandon that, because that's some illusion. You know. So we need the will to power, and we need genealogy, but get rid of freedom. Right. So if you know your Foucault power knowledge discourse. So knowledge is just a will to power. Discourse is just a kind of a technology of power, right? It's a technology of power, right? So knowledge is the will to power, and discourse is the technology of power. A little Heideggerianized Nietzsche, all kind of crap. But anyway. So no, that's not where Nietzsche's coming from. So we tend to get a Foucaultized or a postmodernized Nietzsche. It's not accurate. It's not true. All right, so let's look at how he begins. Because he begins just where we left off with truth and lie in an extra moral sense. We are unknown to ourselves, we men of knowledge, and with good reason. We've never sought ourselves. How could it happen that we should ever find ourselves? Okay. Men of knowledge. So there's a twofold sense here. There's the West, especially in the 19th century, thinking of itself as scientific and progressive. Progressive in terms of the pursuit of truth, understood as objective truth, pursued scientifically. But then there's the men of knowledge, namely the philosopher, right? The specialized province of this pursuit, which, again, the philosopher, less the scientist. So not like The Birth of Tragedy, where he lumped those together, the philosopher and the scientist. We'll see that here he separates them, especially in the third essay. The third essay is really crucial for this piece. Usually people get lost in the first two essays. They get dazzled by the fireworks, and they forget that the entire point is the third essay, where he says asceticism, the meaning of ascetic ideals, meaning ideals born of denying ourselves things, self-denial. And he says the self-denial of the artist is one thing. It's just the discipline of adopting a form. It's a self-imposed discipline. It's saying, I'm not going to paint with every color in the palette, but only some. And he says, that's one thing. He's not talking about that. He's also not talking about the asceticism of the scientist, who might narrow their field of inquiry in order to be more disciplined about it. So in that way, he likens science and art. Says, no, the issue is the asceticism of the philosopher. And that's what he's talking about in terms of a genealogy of morality. Meaning, where the morality, the practical ethos of the philosopher is this pursuit of truth. But it's paradoxical. Right? So scientific truth is different from philosophical truth, also different from artistic truth. Again, very much like in The Birth of Tragedy, we are unknown to ourselves because we've never sought ourselves. Well, why is that? Because the pursuit of knowledge has always been outside ourselves. So it's putting truth outside of ourselves.
Is that why you use paradoxical?
Mm-hmm. Right. So when philosophers are talking about the truth in an external sense, Nietzsche is going to say, no, it's actually their internal truth. When philosophers talk about objective truth, they're really talking about subjective truth. And that's why he says that he is a philosopher. Regrettably, he comes out of this tradition of philosophy, but then he recasts it and says he's a psychologist. Meaning he's looking at the personal motivation of the philosopher. And he's doing so through a self-examination. It's a kind of anticipating of Freud, that the way you understand psychology is through a self-analysis. Mm-hmm.
What's artistic truth?
Good question. It would be the appearance of appearance. It would be the birth of tragedy notion, meaning what art tells us is the truth about the way the world appears to us and how we feel about that appearance. Right? So it's about aesthetic feeling that is bound up with the way the world appears.
Seems like an unpopular opinion recently.
Recently, but that's because you guys are dealing with this insanity, which is that art is research. Art is not research. No. Research is a horrible paradigm anyway. Academic research is the pits, and there's no truth in it whatsoever. There's a lot of discipline and zero truth. Publish or perish, right? You're supposed to do research for the sake of research without ever questioning, is this at all useful knowledge? Useful to who in what way? Right? We're just supposed to be the scribes set to task, just cataloging all the data. Right? That is not what art is. No way, Jose. It's not science. It's not research. Right? It's a shame that everything has to justify itself according to a pseudoscientific rationale. Right? The human sciences. It's sad that art history and philosophy of aesthetics has to justify itself as scientific research. It's even more a shame that artists, especially in an academic setting, have to justify themselves by their work being some kind of research. I would say. Of course, that's my opinion. But channeling Nietzsche, channeling a good, healthy dose of Nietzsche. Mm-hmm.
It seems like artists, people still do care about aesthetics, but the relative importance is minimized compared to other things.
Minimized or driven underground? Remember what Susan Buck-Morse said on the first day of class. Everything that we did on the first day of class is with us throughout this course. Artists might opt to do their work underground, meaning are artists allowed to acknowledge, even to themselves, that what they're doing is first and foremost about the aesthetic? Maybe not, but that doesn't mean that it ain't so. Just because we don't acknowledge it doesn't mean it's not the case.
I do see a lot of aesthetics happening, which is not spoken about.
Exactly, right. And it's maybe best not spoken about, especially in a hostile discursive environment. Right. I mean, the most uncharitable thing that I can say, and the most NPC thing I can say, is that artists can only justify their work according to their personal, social group, and cultural identity. Right? As subjective in that sense, in the sense of the merely subjective, but I guess not merely subjective since it's a community, since you're part of some community or other, and that's what your work essentially is. Or again, as Susan Buck-Morse put it, culture, right? So aesthetics are only admitted insofar as they are the style of a culture, rather than an individual pursuit.
Do you think part of it is just educational? Because it seems like even with artists working in aesthetics, like aesthetics as a concept is never spoken about, even though like the whole of their teaching or practice could be about aesthetics, but they don't mention the word in like 15 years. It's very strange. I have encountered that.
No, it is very strange. I mean, what I would say is this is another theory and practice problem, which is I do think that our practices are impaired by our inadequate theory of our practice. Meaning, I do think that, like, why I teach this course, because I want you guys to consider the aesthetic per se as such, because I think it would be helpful to be able to acknowledge it rather than driving it underground, right?
Well, this is the interesting thing. Well, I can talk about this later if you want.
Go ahead.
So I had this recent studio visit with somebody from the school, and this particular professor's like approach to thinking about and looking at and responding to art is 100% aesthetic experience.
Ah, okay.
So I bring up aesthetics, and she was frustrated that I brought up aesthetics, and she said it was like I was trying to talk about stuff in this theoretical level, which is separate and not relevant. And she was actually annoyed the fact that I brought up that word, and she doesn't like to talk about aesthetic, which is strange because
Her work is about it.
well, and all of her teaching as well. It was peculiar. Like she actually got frustrated.
So then it comes down to how we talk about these things. In
Yeah.
other words, not that we talk about them, but how we talk about them. And so, of course, that makes all the difference. I mean, there's the first problem, which is do we talk about it at all? But the second problem would be how we talk about it. Right? So maybe that was the issue. In other words, maybe it's precisely because she talks about it one way and you talk about it in another way. Right? Huh?
What's like an example of like going to someone's like studio, like I guess the studio is that you had, and like bringing up like what would be like a guiding question to like talk about aesthetics? Like I feel like
I don't know, it would be what artists have inspired you? What work has inspired you and why? What about that artist's work inspires you? That's a question that's asked, right? But again, in asking what would seem to be technical questions, why did you do it this way and not that way? Would inform these decisions. What were you trying to do? What were you trying to get at? Right? I mean, I think that there is a fair amount of discussion of that. But again, it tends to be shunted in the direction of mere technique, as opposed to meaning. Right? The meaning of form, the meaning of aesthetic experience, which again tends to then go in the other direction, which is that it's just personal, cultural, biographical, maybe psychological in character, right? Merely subjective, or wholly technical, which would appear to be, I don't know, maybe objective in some way. So again, if we go back to Kant, theory, practice, judgment, right? So the understanding, reason, and judgment. So we can talk about the concept of a work if we think about it in sort of cultural terms. We can think about the reason for the work in a practical sense if we talk about it technically. But can we talk about judgment, aesthetic judgment? What makes a work good or bad? Taste. Originality. Genius. That's the stuff that's really forbidden or taboo, right? But also our concept of the work tends to be, like I said, a cultural concept rather than an artistic concept. All right. So, self-knowledge, will to truth, will to power, will to life, but in a specific form. Meaning the form of the philosopher. Right, so a kind of self-critique, self-criticism of the philosopher. let's take a break in a moment, but let's look at all right, the problem of the value of pity and the morality of pity. I am opposed to the pernicious modern effeminacy of feeling. It seems at first to be merely something detached and isolated question mark, but whoever sticks with it and learns how to ask questions here will experience what I experienced. A tremendous new prospect opens up for him. A new possibility comes over him like a vertigo. Every kind of mistrust, suspicion, fear leaps up. His belief in morality, in all morality, falters. Finally, a new demand becomes audible. Let us articulate this new demand. We need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called into question. And for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. Morality as consequence, as symptom, as mask, as tartuffery, as illness, as misunderstanding, but also morality as cause, as remedy, as stimulant, as restraint, as poison. A knowledge of a kind that has never yet existed or even been desired. One has taken the value of these values as given, as factual, as beyond all question. One has hitherto never doubted or hesitated in the slightest degree in supposing the good man to be greater than the evil man, of greater value in the sense of furthering the advancement and prosperity of man in general, the future of man included. All right, so notice, he's not ditching the pursuit of knowledge. He's not. He's not abandoning the pursuit of truth. Right, but we might say that he's asking about the truth of truth, the knowledge of knowledge, the value of knowledge, the value of truth. He's not ditching morality. He's not. He's not abandoning the significance, the meaning, the substance of morality. But he is asking about the morality of morality. So why should we value this? As a question, which is not just a debunking, and a critique, not just a deconstruction, to use that other postmodernist term, not just a deconstruction. What if the reverse were true? What if a symptom of regression were inherent in the good? So again, he's arguing against the kind of idea of moral progress. What if a symptom of regression were inherent in the good? Likewise, a danger, a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, through which the present was possibly living at the expense of the future. Perhaps more comfortably, less dangerously, but at the same time in a meaner style and more basely. So that precisely morality would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to the type man was never in fact attained. So that precisely morality was the danger of dangers. Now there's another reading that I want to just quickly do before we take a break. And that is, I mentioned Baudelaire, here's Baudelaire. So you want to know where this thought figure comes from in Nietzsche? It comes from this Baudelaire. So this is an aphorism of Baudelaire's from towards the end of his life. It's from a selection of writings that he drafted, posthumously published under the title Rockets, like fireworks, rockets. Here's Baudelaire. The world is drawing to an end. Only for one reason can it last longer, just because it happens to exist. Suppose it should continue materially, would that be an existence worthy of its name and the historical dictionary? I do not say that the world will be reduced to expedience and the buffoonish disorder of the republics of South America, that perhaps even we shall return to a savage state, and that we will go through the grassy ruins of our civilization, rifle in hand, to seek our grazing ground? No, because such adventures would still suppose a certain vital energy, echo of first ages. We shall furnish a new example of the inexorability of the spiritual and moral laws, and shall be their victims. We shall perish by the very thing by which we fancy that we live. Technocracy will Americanize us. Progress will starve our spirituality so far that nothing of the bloodthirsty, sacrilegious, or unnatural dreams of the utopists will be comparable to such positive results. Universal ruin will manifest itself not solely or particularly in political institutions, or general progress, or whatever else might be a proper name for it. It will be seen above all in the baseness of hearts. So it's 1867, 2024. How does that ring? How does that resonate? Has technocracy Americanized us? Have we outstripped all the utopian, dystopian fantasies in their bloodthirsty and sacrilegious character? We definitely have. We've definitely. To use a term, by the way, so he wrote the piece that we're reading for tonight on the genealogy of morals as a companion, as an explanation for a book that he wrote, a book of aphorisms, Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil. If we keep that phrase in mind, beyond good and evil, it's important. Modernity is beyond good and evil. Freedom is beyond good and evil. The will to power is beyond good and evil.
So we're no longer talking about morality.
Well, we are and we aren't. We're talking about a qualitative transformation of morality, which means that it will appear to any prior form of morality to be beyond morality. I mean, one way that I like to put it is the modern world, and I mentioned capitalism, is evil from any traditional moral standpoint, from any traditional cultural standpoint. Capitalism is evil. The world that we live in is evil. It's not good by any conventional, traditional, cultural, civilizational value system.
Because when you consider beyond good and evil, you would want to assume that is progressive, better, as
It sort of slipped the leash, right?
Yeah.
It's off the chain. It's beyond good and evil, right? And again, that might be a process of producing a new morality, but we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of it, meaning it's not like we have the new morality. So we've kind of ditched the old morality without producing the new one. Mm-hmm.
Ancient cultures and ancient moralities were therefore better, or that the societies that we know were better because, I mean, looking at history, we have seen many patterns that have recognized the same, so is there any point that our morality was good, or has it always just been the same, but we think that we've progressed?
I think that for Nietzsche, he thinks that it's changed. It's actually changed. Whether it's progressed, whether that's a progressive change is something else. Now, of course, we tend to think the way people did things 20 years ago was not up to snuff, was not up to the moral values that we have now as progressive people. More enlightened, more progressive, more moral, right? So, they used to do capital punishment. They still do it, but we kind of don't like it. They used to do it without batting an eyelash. Now we agonize over it. So we must be more moral than they were in the past. Nietzsche's point is that, no, we're not more moral, but something has happened where we don't find... Another way of putting it would be, so people of the past had morality. They were moral. They were. We might think, stoning a woman to death for adultery, that doesn't sound particularly moral. And we like Jesus saying, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. But guess what? They still threw stones after Jesus. I mean, after all, they crucified Jesus. So, right, pretty much for saying that. Right, you can't stone a woman? Kill that guy. Right? Okay. And like I said, actually, it's not only did people do it long after Jesus, still do it. Still do it. in their own way. Still do it literally, still do it figuratively, still do it. Right? So people were moral, but their morality kind of offends us. Does offend us. So we have a different morality. But how did we get here from there? How did that happen? Right? It's not simply like progress. It's not simply, oh, now we know better. That's what we tend to think. Now we know better. Right? We don't know better. We know differently. We don't know better. But we're in the midst of something. So what makes modernity peculiar, it's not just a new value system, it's a crisis of the value system. Now, I bring up also, there are religious fundamentalists who are extremely motivated, very motivated, throughout the world, right? To reestablish an old morality. They're willing to do everything. Suicide bombing, everything. To bring back the old morality because we've lost our way. Right, to save us from ourselves, they're willing to do anything. Anything. Right? So we haven't gotten to that point in the United States where Christian fundamentalists are doing suicide bombing, but we could get to that point. That could happen. Of course that could happen. Right? We don't have quite the breakdown that you see in the Muslim world that produces that kind of fundamentalist violence. But yeah, it could happen. Of course it could happen. Right? So why? Why would people ever do that? Because we live in a morally problematic world. We do. We do. And so that suggests that the solution to that might be to go back. Now, of course, Nietzsche's not saying that. He's definitely not saying that. He's raising another question, which is not just that was then, this is now, but rather what's beyond now? Right? So, could we be living at the expense of the future? Could we be experiencing a regression insofar as we mistake it for progress, but really we're in crisis? All right, let's take a short break, and we'll come back. All right, let's resume. All right, so I'm going to turn to your notes, and you guys can guide us through, you might say, and get more concrete about it. Okay, cool. So how did you guys divide it up? How did you want to do it?
We just did it on each course thing. Yeah,
Separately.
yeah,
Separately.
just
Okay, so not collaboratively.
No.
Okay.
Didn't realize it was supposed to be.
No, that's okay. All right, so let's let me say something about the structure of the whole book, and then we can dive into the details of it. So it's 3 essays, and it's sort of building the argument. Like I said, the 3rd essay is really the point of the book. It's really the purpose of it. And the meaning of aesthetic ideals, meaning the meaning of ideals based on a kind of self-denial or asceticism. So the first 2 essays that set up the 3rd essay have a more sequential character, but also are coming at things at a different angle. So good and bad and good and evil, the difference between good and bad and good and evil. In other words, the origin of the notion of good versus evil. So I mentioned Beyond Good and Evil, the book of aphorisms that he wrote, that this is meant to accompany. And then finally, the conscience, the bad conscience, the origin of the bad conscience. So first of all, good and bad versus good and evil, this is the first transvaluation of values. This is the slave revolt in morality. It's also the occasion for him to introduce one of his significant words, significant terms in the text, resentment. Resentment. So he does what we've talked about a little bit last time with The Birth of Tragedy. He's trained in classical philology, so he does almost a linguistic analysis of these words, good and bad. Especially, he doesn't really do good and evil so much, he does good and bad. Where good and bad are not opposed, the way good and evil are opposed, rather good and bad, there's a kind of a hierarchical value, meaning it's not good as opposed to bad, it's rather good and not so good, meaning bad is sort of not good. Right, so kind of excellent versus poor. So why is that significant? Because good and bad is centered on the good, but centered on the good in the sense of something that defines itself as good. So the definition of the good doesn't depend on a definition of the bad. It's self-defining, meaning one defines oneself as good as opposed to not so good or bad. So it's about, to talk about what we mentioned earlier, the value of the values, meaning good as a value in itself, good as a self-defining value. Right? There's no question of what the value of the good is. It's kind of self-evident. Now, when he says that, he's saying that in terms of, well, the good get to define themselves as good. So the beautiful, the strong, the intelligent get to define what those values are based on themselves. But also in a community, everyone values the virtuous. Everyone values the beautiful, the strong, the intelligent. So it's kind of a self-evident value that the entire community shares. And again, it means better as opposed to worse. Good as opposed to bad.
What about then how do you define the worst? Just less than?
Yeah, I mean, did you guys watch the Olympics this summer? No? Nobody watched the Olympics? Not even for a second? No gymnastics? Nothing? No awesome performances?
Climbing.
Exactly. So there are people who are really great at these things, right? And, then there are people who are not so good. Right?
So it's not antagonizing.
Right. It's not oppositional. It's not antagonistic in that sense. That's right. But good and evil are antagonistic, opposed values. Right? But the transvaluation in values involved in good and bad becoming good and evil, so here's the twist, is that the slave revolt in morality, motivated by resentment, is that the good is redefined as evil and the bad is redefined as good. Right? So to be virtuous, to be strong, beautiful, intelligent, might make you evil. Now what he has in mind is, of course, Christianity. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. It's harder for a wealthy man to get into the kingdom of God than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. All these wonderful little Jesus sayings. All right? So if you have it too good in this life, you're evil. right? Blessed are the sick. It's another Jesusism. It's another Christian idea. And Nietzsche's like, that's not the way the Brahmins thought about it. Right? The Brahmins are like strong, beautiful, intelligent, awesome, healthy. That's good. Everything else not so good. Not blessed are the sick. Not the last shall be first. Not the weak shall inherit the earth. The weak shall inherit the earth. Ugh. What are you talking about? The weak shall inherit the earth? What the hell is that? How will the weak inherit the earth? So it's a complicated story because it goes back a very long time. It's not like there's just one moment of it. Right? So the slave revolt and morality, it's a kind of an ongoing thing. Again, we talked about Socrates. He's the ugly philosopher. Before Socrates, philosophers were strong and beautiful. They weren't weak and ugly. Right? Because it was healthy mind, healthy body. Right? You couldn't be a good philosopher if you were physically unfit, according to the Greeks. Because how would that work? You're a spaz, but you can think well? What the fuck? No. Right? Right, so agility in physical activity, agility in thinking were considered the same thing. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. Oof. All right, so, again, just keeping in mind last week that there's a new conception of philosophy, there's a new conception of truth involved in the Socratic term. There's a new conception of virtue involved in that term. So Socrates and Jesus are connected for Nietzsche. There are these moments in terms of the history of the West where an older value system is being overthrown. But the slave revolt and morality. So there are two slave revolts in morality. There's Moses, let my people go, the exodus from bondage in Egypt. But there's also Jesus. There's the Christian slave revolt and morality. A revolt against the Jewish authorities and a revolt against the Roman authorities, since the Jews were conquered by the Romans. And of course, the Romans were definitely the kick-ass, beautiful people, just like the Egyptians had been. But also the authorities. The Jewish authorities, they had their own aristocracy, they had their own priestly caste, and Jesus denounced them all. Mm-hmm.
What specifically is the older value system in relation to Socrates and Jesus that you kind of talk about?
Oh, good and bad, as opposed to evil. So there's evil and there's evil. So evil can just mean harmful. In other words, it can just be invidious to life. But then there's evil in this other sense that he's talking about, whereby actually virtue can work against morality. So again, harmful in what sense? So being intelligent or beautiful or strong might be harmful, not physically harmful, spiritually harmful. Might be a danger to your soul. Right, that's what he's talking about. So again, evil, thinking about evil, there's a very practical notion of evil, which is something that's harmful. But then again, how could these virtues ever be harmful? They're not harmful. Well, they're harmful in this other sense. Right? They might be a threat to your soul. They might be a threat to your moral virtue, but understood in a very different way from the older form of morality. So what he calls the older form of morality is the morality of mores. Morality of mores. It's kind of an anthropological word. Morality of mores is just behavior, meaning a community values some behavior, calls it virtuous, and everything that goes against that behavior is forbidden or disparaged, seen as harmful. The morality of mores, something that is just practical in nature, meaning do this, don't do that. Now we're getting into the bad conscience. So in the second essay, he says, well, what about morality when it's not a morality of mores, where it's not just about what you do, but again, somehow your soul. Your soul is in the balance. The doer and the deed, where he talks about the separation of the doer and the deed. So at first, when you have a morality of mores, you can't separate the doer from the deed. The person is essentially what they do. There isn't a value to the person separate from what they do. There isn't like the soul of the murderer that you might want to save. The murderer is just a bad person because he does bad things, commits bad acts.
Isn't like bad conscience, like I guess according to Nietzsche, like humans suppressing their natural animalistic behaviors to society, like so how could, I guess like how you're relating that to like evil, like how is that?
Right, so we would consider acting on instinct evil, right? And we would consider it to be inhuman, even though it is human, because humans are animals. So he had that word in The Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, the anthropomorphisms. And I think that I mentioned that by contrast, Nietzsche's going to engage in zoomorphisms, meaning he's going to not attribute human characteristics to animals, but rather animal characteristics to humans. So there is, in his account of the development through qualitative transformation of morality, there is a time when humans were not quite human, in the sense that we think of humanity, when humans were more animal. Right? So the bird of prey, the blonde beast, the bird of prey. Right? So do we want the bird of prey not to eat right? Do we hold it against the bird of prey that it has to hunt and kill and consume? So I live in a high-rise building, and I live a couple of floors down from the top of the building, and on the roof of the building is nested some kestrels, birds of prey, and it's pretty gruesome. So I have my desk is in a corner window, and it's floor-to-ceiling windows. It's a great view of the city and of the lake. However, the kestrel nest is right above. So they kind of scream and swoop and grab another bird, kill it, and then they bring it back. And sometimes they like spray blood from the prey bird on my window, right? So it's pretty gruesome, right? But whatever, they're fine. They're just doing what they're doing. So, you're not going to say, oh, how immoral. The kestrel is killing the poor little sparrows, right? And I think Nietzsche puts it in terms of the bird of prey and the little lamb. And he says, according to our morality, we would consider the bird of prey to have a hateful relationship to the little lamb. But no, the little lamb might hate the bird of prey for preying on it, for killing it, but the bird of prey loves the little lamb, loves it to death, loves to eat it. Right? So again, from what standpoint is the bird of prey evil? Not from its own standpoint, only from the standpoint of its victim, but that's the only way that it can live. Meaning, can you try to hold the bird of prey responsible for its actions? No. Not really. So it's only humans who hold ourselves responsible for our instinctual impulses and nature, right? And of course, this is what makes us human rather than animal. we act against our instincts. Now, he's not saying that that's like bad. He's saying it's problematical, and certainly we suffer as a consequence of that. So here's the other point. Very important point. So we suffer in a way that the animals don't. So the animals suffer when life sucks. Meaning, if the kestrel gets an infection, or one of the prey animals fights back and it gets injured, then that's a certain kind of suffering. But if the kestrel were to say, oh, it's wrong for me to kill the little birds that I eat, right? Then the kestrel would suffer in another way, but would be making itself suffer. That's what we do to ourselves. We make ourselves suffer. And not by accident or by mistake, but actually it seems to be in our nature that humans choose suffering. That we suffer in ways that we don't need to as animals, right? Not simply because physical life is fragile and life sucks and then you die. But no, we make ourselves suffer, we choose suffering, we pursue suffering. And why and how do we do that? Because it makes our lives meaningful in a way that our lives would not be meaningful otherwise. Now, I mentioned about asceticism and science and art and philosophy. So I said, he kind of excludes from his consideration the asceticism of the artist or of the scientist. However, the artist, like being an artist, making art, it is a choice of suffering. It is a choice of suffering, in fact. Certainly in the modern world, where it's not like you can just be a member of a craft guild and be taken care of because you've been taught the skills you need and you have the talent. And so you can be a slave to the guild, but a well-fed slave. No, you have to die starving in a garret because there's no market for your work, right? And yet people choose that. They choose a unprofitable vocation, art. Similarly, science. Meaning nobody has to be a scientist, and involved in the pursuit of science would be a fair amount of suffering, especially if you're trying to discover new things that people may not be ready for. Also with the philosopher. So there is, in those three different domains, a choice of suffering that we can say is conventionally, culturally, socially sanctioned. We do want people to be artists and philosophers and scientists, I guess. We do need people to be artists and philosophers and scientists. Whether we want them to be exactly, whether we have a good way of justifying that, is something else. But more broadly, we live in a social, moral, cultural community in which we impose a suffering on human beings that they don't have to have by nature. Right? Like, according to our nature as primates, there's no particular reason why you should suffer through 3 hours of a philosophy lecture by Professor Cutrone. And yet you do choose to do so. Right? Or do 4 years at the Art Institute. And yet you choose to do so. Right? So why? I mean, you could say, okay, it's a socially imposed game, but that we're compelled to do because society forces us to do these things. But no, we still have our choice. To a certain extent, we have our choice. And of course, Nietzsche is concerned with that. He's concerned with that. But what if the things that we choose to impose ourselves, the suffering that we choose to impose on ourselves, to give our lives meaning, come to a point where that meaning is problematical? Meaning it's not self-evidently clear to oneself or to one's community what the purpose of art or science or philosophy actually is. He thinks that he's living in that moment. He thinks in the late 1800s, European civilization has come to the point where these self-imposed disciplines of suffering no longer are able to provide meaning unproblematically, but in fact seem to be ending up in a kind of nihilistic cul-de-sac or dead end. Right, so why science? Why art? Why philosophy? Again, he's going to privilege philosophy in a particular way, especially moral philosophy. Thought I heard someone say something? No, not yet. Okay. All right, so we really only become human when we develop a bad conscience. Right, so conscience in terms of doing what works, right, sort of driving yourself onward out of experience. Bad conscience is something else. Bad conscience is something else. So bad conscience is not just motivating us, but it's also making us suffer. In that we question our own morality. We question our own moral worth, our own moral adequacy. So bad conscience. And where does that come from? Because it's not obvious where that might originate. So first he says that it comes from outside, and then it's something that we internalize and learn to impose on ourselves. So he says, over a very long period of time and through blood and more blood, humans were trained to become animals with the right to make promises. With the right to make promises. Right? Not the obligation, but the right. In other words, can you make a promise and fulfill it or not? What he has in mind here is the aristocracy, is the warrior caste, is the noble morality. Meaning the nobles start out as birds of prey who are defined by their action, meaning they slay, they kick ass, they're killers. And generally what you have is a situation where the church says, well, God made them that way. So peasants steer clear, priests, fellow priests steer clear of these birds of prey. They might kill you, right? So if you encounter a noble on the road, probably they'll just be like, let's see if my sword is still sharp. Right? But that's just what they are. It's just what they do. It's the way God made them. Can't blame them for that. Right? They defend us against the heathen. No, but at a certain point, the nobles question their own virtues. The nobles question their own values. And that's the way he understands classical antiquity. That's the way he understands also Christianity. So in classical antiquity, the Romans are the paradigmatic kick-ass people, right? It's Romulus and Remus raised by a wolf. How fucked up is that? Also, the children of Mars and Venus, both of whom are gods of war, right? So they're like Mars and Venus. If Mars and Venus are at war, the children of Mars and Venus, who are abandoned and left orphaned to be raised by a wolf, right? And that's the story that community told itself. We are those people, right? We're raised on wolf milk, right? Super kick-ass. And they just slay. Like, that's what they do. They conquer, right? And when we think of like the Roman Republic, when we think of the Roman Senate, when we think of like Roman politics, who are those people? They're the warrior caste. That's who they are. Now, they also borrow because they're too into slaying really to develop a culture of their own. So they take the Greek culture and they say, oh yeah, that's cool. They conquer the Greeks and then they take their culture. But let's go back to the Greeks. Who were the citizens in the democracy? They were, again, the warriors. They were the warrior caste. They were the nobility. They were the aristocracy. And yet, at a certain point, they became artists and philosophers and even scientists. Right? So they at a certain point question their own values, question the purpose of their existence. They turn around and examine themselves. So that's why he says that when the doer and the deed are separated, that's when an action no longer has a self-evident value, but has to be justified. And that's where the human being acquires depth, becomes self-regarding in a new and different way, develops a conscience. So developing a conscience in terms of a sense of duty, like the duty to slay, that's pretty straightforward. The bad conscience, maybe I should feel guilty at having slain. Where does that come from? And that comes from that value system reaching a certain limit. A limit through being fulfilled. Right? So the idea is that once the warriors are able to exercise their strength, realize the virtue of their strength, then they come to a point where they might question the purpose of it. That's when the successful warrior might retreat to the monastery in order to have a spiritual enlightenment, not available to them as noble, aristocratic warriors. And indeed, that's the story of Buddha. Buddha is a prince. Princes are warriors, right? And Buddha gives up all of that in favor of a higher meaning, a higher calling. But that's from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. And that's why he says, okay, this new European Buddhism of the 19th century is not like the original Buddhism, because it's not coming from a position of strength, it's coming from a position of weakness. It's a crisis of meaning, not from fulfillment, but from failure, from dissatisfaction, or from resentment. Right? So to choose to deny oneself life out of a position of fulfillment is very different from denying life from a position of resentment. To deny life from the standpoint of satisfaction is different from denying life from the standpoint of dissatisfaction. So that's what he calls the priestly morality. The priestly morality. And his narrative is that the priests subordinate the warriors. So the priests subordinate the warriors when the warriors reach the limits of fulfillment of their own values and develop a conscience, and the priests play off that. So again, historically, what does he have in mind? The Christianization of Rome. The Christianization of Rome. So what did the Romans do with the Christians originally? Do you know? They burned their bodies to light the Colosseum for the gladiatorial games. They were like, these people are so worthless, we're just going to use them as fuel for torches. But then, the ruling class of Rome converted to Christianity. Why would they ever have done that? Why would they ever have done that? Again, from a position of fulfillment, from a position of success. So the idea is that at the height of their civilization, they suddenly developed a conscience and they embraced Christianity. But that's different from preaching Christianity to the subaltern, right, to the wretched of the earth. Right, to convince the nobility that they're no better than the wretched of the earth is different from preaching to the wretched of the earth that they are better than the nobility. Right? So, in other words, if the priests go to the poor and say, "You're no better than the rich," that has a very different meaning than going to the rich and saying, "You're no better than the poor." Excuse me, you're better than the rich. You go to the poor and tell them they're better than the rich. It's very different than going to the rich and telling them that they're no better than the poor. So I mentioned the warrior who could go to the monastery. So what do you do when you go to the monastery? You take a vow of poverty. You take a vow of chastity. You give up sex. Right? And of course, you're not going to slay either. Right? So then what's left? Right? So if you can't have wealth or sex or poverty, or violence, yes. You can only have poverty. Why would you ever do that? Again, for a higher spiritual purpose. As a self-overcoming. As a self-overcoming. So
define as self-overcoming, or
it's when they see themselves. So if you tell the poor that the rich are evil, if you tell the weak that the strong are evil, that's very different than the strong
but then there will be some,
realizing that they might be evil, or the rich realizing that they might be evil.
yeah, that's instructed instead of that shouldn't be considered as self-overcoming because
It's
you're
not a
instruct-
self-overcoming,
yeah,
right.
You've been instructed to
That's exactly right. So it's only self-overcoming when the ruling class does it. And of course, that's the other point about Christianity is that the modern world has this kind of notion of Christianity. Also, the Old Testament, Moses, right? So how did Moses lead the revolt of the Jews to escape bondage? Well, first of all, he's the adopted son of the Pharaoh. So he's living the life. And he's the favored son of the Pharaoh, even though he's the adopted son of the Pharaoh. He's living the life, meaning that it's from a position of strength and fulfillment. And then he goes to the slaves and are like, we should revolt, right? But otherwise they were not revolting. Yes, quite. So Moses is pretty easy to explain. Jesus is harder to explain. Jesus is the more difficult one. Jesus is like Buddha is easy to explain. Jesus is a little bit more difficult. The son of a carpenter. Now the son of God. Now the son of a carpenter. Well, it's kind of both. So if the ruling class had not converted to Christianity, then there would have been no Christianity. And if you know your history and you know your language the way Nietzsche certainly did. So, have you heard of paganism? Do you know what that means? Do you know what the word pagan means? It means peasant. Meaning, paganism is the religion of the peasants. Meaning, nobody cared what their religion was. They, of course, had their kind of folk religion, which was not Christianity. So who were Christians in the Middle Ages? Well, of course, the priests were Christians. The nobility was Christian. Kind of. Meaning the nobility were still slaying. But the priests convinced them to try to repent for it. Right, which usually meant turning over their ill-gotten gains to the church. Like buying your way to heaven is what the Protestants called it. In authentic Christianity. We have it running. No, we have not. Okay. All right. So, again, it wasn't a matter of the peasants becoming Christian. That happened much later. It was a matter of the nobility. So first the Roman nobility, and then the German nobility. So when the Germans took over the Roman civilization, when they established the Holy Roman Empire, of the kind of post-Roman Christian Empire. Well, the Germans were, of course, the kick-ass warriors too. They conquered Europe, and yet they embraced Christianity as well. Maybe at first dubiously, and then more thoroughly. Right. So, again, what's the meaning of Christianity? The meaning of Christianity in the modern world, among the plebeian masses, might be quite different than the meaning of Christianity in late antiquity or in medieval civilization. Right, so it's really with Protestantism, which is a kind of fundamentalist revolt in the bourgeois era, that you get a kind of thorough Christianization of Europe. Prior to that, the peasants, no, they were pagans. They weren't really. They were Christian, but alongside other things. They actually had syncretic practices. So they kind of adopted Christianity and fused it with the folk religion. But nobody really cared that they were not like 100% Christians until Protestantism came along. It also didn't help, or it did help, depending on how you look at it. Of course, they couldn't read the Bible. The nobility mostly couldn't read the Bible either. I mean, they were semi-literate, and then the priests read the Bible and preached it. But it never occurred to anyone, like the peasants, that they needed to read the Bible until the Reformation. That's when the Bible is put into the people's hands. It's when people need to become literate. Why? So they can read the Bible in the vernacular. It's translated. They do Mass in vernacular as opposed to, before that, they did it in Latin and nobody understood. Right? So interestingly enough, Christianity only attained the kind of cultural dominance among the people when it no longer meant what it originally meant. Right? This would be another example of these kind of perverse permutations.
That's what I was thinking when you were talking about truth and lie. When he was attacking language and semiotics, it's essentially, is he referring to that? Well, like
Right.
the meaning,
Right.
without really knowing the meaning, just accepting this. Well,
Right, so you can, right, so language comes out of a kind of will to power,
yeah.
but then it becomes conventionalized, and then it no longer has that value. But then people reinvent language, or they change the meaning of things, and that would come
Layers of meanings attached to it. Isn't that the same
with morality.
Exactly, because it's ever changing. It's new. It's not.
That's right. So, again, there are people who do it herd-like. He says herd-like, right? Lie in a style obligatory to all. And then there are those who are doing it more authentically or legitimately, who have the right to do it, right? Again, to train an animal with the right to make promises. So yes, you can force people to have obligations, but that's different from a self-imposed obligation. Right, so notice also the bad conscience comes from a debt relationship and comes from religion as a debt relationship. I want to make some mention of that. So religion as a debt relationship, again, Nietzsche himself, trained as a classical philologist, he knows European civilization, European languages, he knows Greek and Roman and Latin, culture and civilization. But then he has friends who are studying non-Western languages and cultures. So he's very much aware that that this kind of problem of morality is not just European, and he can look at it from different angles. And so language as a will to power, language as an assertion of self-overcoming. Right. So he wants to estrange us from what we think we already know. Right, so he's sort of challenging the received wisdom. And he thinks that that's the moment for it. The late 19th century is the moment where Western values are coming into question. And they're coming to question themselves, meaning if they're coming into question, he thinks that it's coming from within. It's not coming from outside. So there is this moment of potential self-overcoming, however complicated by the fact that now it's a mass society, it's a mass culture, mass literacy. Now everyone is invited to participate in the dominant value system, whether appropriately or inappropriately. It has been popularized, we can say. And we can also say, again, there are parallels to Foucault here. Foucault is a kind of a knockoff Nietzschean, where he says that European civilization is becoming a kind of prison, military barracks, factory, hospital. Right? It's a place for the sick to treat the sick. For people for whom repetitive labor seems the most appropriate activity. So he has in mind kind of proletarianized labor, industrial capitalist labor. Right? So people for whom repetitive activity seems the most appropriate. This kind of nihilism that Europe is arriving at in terms of the last man who might become the first man, the last man who might become the overman. Yeah. So I said morality is developed through blood and more blood. Morality is a self-vivisection torture device that we subject ourselves to. So what does that mean? So we're torturing ourselves, but we're also examining ourselves at the same time. So we're dissecting ourselves, we're also torturing ourselves. Oh, that was the point that I was driving towards with the history of religion. Religion starts with ancestor worship. Religion originates with ancestor worship, he thinks. Anthropologically, all religion starts with ancestor worship, which is interesting. But again, this is they're aware, people like Nietzsche, his academic cohort, schooled in archaeology and anthropology, schooled in classical philology, in all the different classical civilizations. They know world history at this point. And so, is that available directly in a European context? Not so much, but it is available through Chinese culture, right? Ancestor worship is there.
That's why I wanted to ask about when he's talking about worship, there's an established power system, and it never seems to. Well, it was lingering, it was suggesting, but it never really comes to this discussion on like power or how that.
It's the creditor-debtor relationship. In other words, why do we worship the ancestors? Still, the founding fathers of the United States are venerated, right? Because we owe them our existence. But in a very literal sense, why would one have filial piety? Respect your parents.
So that
because you literally owe your life to them. Right? So the guilt that the parents instill in the child is the guilt of, well, you owe me your life.
Yeah.
Right? And then he says that culture is the sort of ramification of that, whereby the founders of a culture become godlike figures. Right? So they increase in stature as the civilization grows, and the debt mounts and becomes unpayable, meaning it becomes a kind of an infinite debt. And he ties Christianity into that. Right? So he ties Christianity that we owe Jesus for paying our debt, which was unfathomably infinite, original sin. So Jesus paid our debt, and because Jesus paid our debt, we owe Jesus an infinite amount, right? Paradoxically, did I mention to you guys, so I mentioned these fundamentalists, right? So because we have all this crazy shit going on, I'll just bring up, as an example, Hamas. I will bring up Hamas because there's a guy who is very anti-Hamas, who kind of a propagandist, and he was the son of one of the founders of Hamas. So he's known as the son of Hamas, but he's very anti-Hamas. Right, so basically, his observation about Christianity, he escaped Palestine because he met a Christian missionary and converted to Christianity. And what he said was, what he learned from Christianity is that Jesus redeemed humanity from religion. Meaning, Christianity could be misunderstood as like, okay, you were redeemed, but now you owe. And he's like, no, what I learned from Jesus is that we're all redeemed from religion itself, which is of course true. And yet Nietzsche knows that too. Except Nietzsche's like, oh, but then the Christians did reimpose, right? So in other words, it was supposed to be an absolving of all debt, right? And yet, then the Christians turned around and reimposed the debt on themselves, right? And so why did they do that? Again, he's looking at it psychologically, but he's looking at it culturally. He's like, well, of course, Christianity was the end of religion, and yet it became a religion, and therefore it must still have this character, this pattern, right? Except now it's been fully abstracted and made kind of infinite, so it's no longer that of a particular culture that owes its ancestors. But in a much more general sense, we live under a kind of infinite guilt or infinite debt. Which again, he sees as laying the groundwork for the nihilism. Because that's really the issue. The issue is why has European civilization and culture, why has European humanity, the European man, ended up in a place of nihilism? If you remember from the first week of class, we read Robert Pippin's On Critical Theory, and yeah, Robert Pippin said we need Kant on appearance, we need Hegel on dialectic and teleology, and we need Marx on contradiction, and we need Nietzsche on the nihil in nihilism. We need Nietzsche on the nihil in nihilism. Right.
I still don't understand that part. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it was a very long.
The third part.
Yeah.
The third part. The third essay is complicated. So the idea is that we've arrived at a place of ultimate meaninglessness in a way unprecedented in human history. And yet, meaninglessness is our meaning. Right? In other words, we've preserved the will to meaning and the will to truth by arriving at this nihilistic, ultimate meaninglessness, ultimate relativization of truth, ultimate questioning of truth. And yet, that is our truth. Right? So it's not an absence of truth, it's actually the ultimate truth. And that's where he comes full circle. So rather than locating it in theoretical man and the Socratic turn, which remained kind of mysterious, it's rather much more recent. It has a history, but it's much more recent. Because, of course, Socrates was not arriving at a nihilistic dead end. It seems to suggest the possibility thereby, in the same way that Jesus seems to be the end of religion, which would have to be an ultimate meaninglessness. So why would he have been denounced by his own community? Of course, because he was a blasphemer. And the Romans kind of could care less. You guys know your Christianity. Pontius Pilate, so he's the governor, he's the Roman ruler, and the Jews bring Jesus and are like, he's a blasphemer, you must put him to death, right? Because they're living under Roman occupation. And then he has a dialogue with Jesus, and he's like, oh, he seems like a harmless guy, right? So why would I put him to death? Right? And then he gives the crowd an opportunity to save Jesus by saying, I'll save one, I'll save this murderer, Barabbas, or I'll save Jesus, who seems like a harmless guy. And the crowd are like, we want Barabbas. We want you to save Barabbas. We want you to kill Jesus. And then he's like, okay, I wash my hands of it. These crazy people that we're occupying, they have their whack religion, and so what can you do? Right? So again, from the standpoint of his own community, Jesus was a blasphemer. From his own religious community, from the standpoint of the Roman authorities, secular political authority, he was kind of harmless, but in a kind of meaningless way. But then, of course, when it caught on, the Romans did think that the Christians were nihilists. They did. They thought that's what they didn't like about the Christians. They were like, oh, the Christians, if we listen to them, everything that we think of as our virtues would be meaningless. That's the original reception of Christianity by the Romans, and yet they also were ultimately converted to it. Right? Because you could say Socrates gave meaning to potential meaninglessness, the infinite pursuit of truth, without ever the possibility of satisfaction. And Jesus gave meaning to the potential meaninglessness of being forgiven for all of our sins, meaning no longer being under any earthly obligation other than to embrace that forgiveness. Right? So saved meaning by embracing the meaninglessness, right? So all the traditional religious practices were kind of meaningless, right? That's why they had to put him to death. And Nietzsche thinks we're in a similar position in modernity, which is that the threat of ultimate meaninglessness is the meaning. Right? The discovery that there is no truth other than our will to truth, which is our will to power, it's a will to life, that there's no truth outside of us, is saving truth in the paradoxical or ironical form of the apparent annihilation of truth. But then it's actually preserving the truth. So that's the difficult part, because he's trying to diagnose something. In other words, he's not propounding it. Here's something that speaking of Christianity, so I was raised Catholic. Not surprisingly. Chris Cutrone, Italian-American. Also, you can look at me, I'm Irish. So, Christianity, Catholicism. And I was a smart ass. So I told the priest, this Christianity, I don't really believe in it. And he was sophistic and he said, well, if you don't believe in God, then you don't believe in anything, because God is everything. Right? Nihilism. Where was it going with that? Right, that Christianity is reduced to this point of, for Nietzsche, of either the ultimate terminus of meaning, or it can flip over into the restoration of meaning. We're going to get to this next week with the case of Wagner, because Nietzsche is going to address Wagner as a kind of self-conceived anti-Christian, pagan kind of artist. He's a modernist artist, but then seems to, in this roundabout way, reconcile himself to Christianity in his last opera in Parsifal, but in this very strange way, in this kind of hippie way, in this kind of paganized way. And Nietzsche is going to ridicule, but also critique, how it would be that Wagner's work could have come to that point. So there's going to be the question again of the relationship of art and religion, but also art and philosophy. So Wagner is going to be a case where Wagner thought of himself as irreligious, thought of himself as philosophical, but then seemed to revert to a kind of religiosity and seemed to point to this problem of whether philosophy could justify art or not. Right, so Wagner is someone who wrote a lot about his art, about music, and about art more generally, tried to give it a philosophical justification, and was a kind of bohemian radical who tried to give it a kind of moral justification contra traditional religion as well. So, oops. All right, so some of these themes actually we'll be able to revisit. So you're going to see that the case of Wagner is a kind of coda to the genealogy of morals, meaning it's a similar discussion, it's based on the same ideas, but applied to a particular case. And it's going to be Wagner as a musician, as an artist, but also Wagner's kind of his last work and how it kind of culminated all of his previous work. I might have mentioned to you guys we have 3 authors on our syllabus who are themselves artists. Schiller, Nietzsche, because Nietzsche's a musician, and then Adorno, who's also a musician. Nietzsche is going to be taking up Wagner as an artist. And again, the way 19th century art struggled to justify itself and reached for things like philosophy to justify itself. I will also mention to you guys, because you should listen to the music that's there, that's on Canvas in the files folder. So there are 2, Nietzsche's going to have 2 counterexamples. He's going to have Wagner's Parsifal, and he's going to have Bizet's Carmen, if you guys know Carmen. All right, so 2 operas, Carmen and Parsifal, and he's going to make a kind of invidious comparison. He's going to make a kind of a negative. He's going to say that Carmen is great and Parsifal is awful. And we will also have Adorno. We'll have the first reading that we're doing from Adorno, Fantasia Sopra Carmen, which is Adorno's essay in response to Nietzsche. Right, so Adorno's going to take up Nietzsche's critique of Wagner and give it a kind of dialectical twist and try to bring out some of the more implicit, the implications of Nietzsche on Wagner. But these themes will come back. So the question of nihilism, the question of Christianity's role in nihilism, the question of philosophy's role in nihilism, but also how art is bound up now with this problem of nihilism. So in some ways we'll come full circle to the birth of tragedy, but via the genealogy of morals next week. Okay.